Good morning. Welcome to the Boardwalk. My name is Mendel Graber. I am one of the educators here at the lab, and this morning we're going to be chatting with PhD student Joclyn Villegas about dolphin communication. So the sounds the dolphins make, the clicks and whistles, and the meaning behind them. So with that, I'm going to let Joclyn tell you a little bit about that.
Yes, awesome. So like she said, I'm Joclyn. I am a PhD in the Marine Science Department. My lab is the Comparative Cognition and Communication Lab. So what we like to look at is how our different animals, specifically dolphins, what are their cognitive abilities, how do they communicate with each other? What are dolphins saying and what are they doing when they might be feeling, when they're in this positive, which is just a fancy way of saying, what do they say and do when they're having positive emotions, like if they're happy or excited, if they feel joy. So when we have positive feelings, when we have these positive emotions, people are we love a good visual cue. We have lots of gestures. So if you're at a football game, your team scores, we cheer, we shout, we shake our fists, we jump up and down. So we use a lot of these physical gestures, but dolphins like a good acoustic cue. So they use a lot of the auditory signals. And that's because if you think about jumping out into just off the coast right here in the waters here, the visibility in the ocean, it's not that great. So instead of using these visual cues where they would, if Bob's over here and I'm over here and I want to, hey, there's some fish this way, you need to come over here. Instead of flapping my fins or making a little wiggle dance, it's much easier and more reliable for them to give an acoustic signal. And they use these sounds to either call another dolphin over, or they'll use it in different behaviors. Aggression. Again, I look at positive emotion, joy. So how then do they make these sounds? So I have my little handy dandy dolphin volunteer, and what they do, so their blowhole is right here at the top of their melon, and underneath their blowhole they have air sacs. So you can kind of think of it as like our nasal passageway, just different locations. So if you were to look, they have these air sacs. And when they go underwater, so one theory of how they make sound underwater is they'll take a breath, and then when they go underwater, this air will return back into their air sacs, and then when they expel the air from the sac, there is this nasal plug. And so the air comes out and shoots through the nasal plug, and it starts making these different noises. You can think of it like a balloon. So the balloon's the air sac. When you let the balloon go, that air comes out of the balloon. You get a bunch of that little like raspberry kind of noises. So that's one theory how they're making sound underwater.
Joclyn, can they breathe through their mouth and their nose? They're
getting the air from their blowhole. This is where their nasal passageway is. I mean, they'll open their mouth, but I don't really think they don't really use that much for breathing. It's more like swallow their food.
Or for the sounds that they're making.
Yeah, the sounds will actually come from the blowhole. So if you see a dolphin above water, especially if you go to like an aquarium, there's dolphins. And if you take a look at their blowhole when they're making all those fun noises that the trainers ask them for, you'll see the shape of their blowhole change. They have excellent muscle control up here, probably because they use that so much to, not just breathe, but also make these different types of sounds. So you'll see it change shape, and you can, keep an eye on it. And one vocal the trainer asks, might be this shape. The next, you'll press it together. So that's something you can look out for.
Like the sound would change as air exits a balloon if you change the shape?
Yeah, exactly. If you press it and squeeze it or make it more open, you're changing the vibrations that it's hitting. So it's going to make different sounds. So talking on their sounds, I have a couple sounds that we can listen to just to get a good, we're talking about sounds, I figure we should hear the sounds.
I think we can make it loud enough for you to hear.
But they've got, so while this is loading, they have different types of sounds. There's 3 main categories. They have the whistles, and then they have burst pulses, and then they have those echolocation clicks. So this one will be a nice whistle. So we've got a couple whistles here. Everyone kind of heard it. So an interesting thing about the whistle is that dolphins have, so like we have names, dolphins have what we call a signature whistle. And the signature whistle theory is that each dolphin has a specific whistle that can refer to themselves. So they have a whistle that's kind of like a name to them. And they'll use this, especially mothers. Mothers will use this as a contact call for their calf. So it takes usually about a year for a dolphin to develop its signature whistle. And then after that, it's pretty stable throughout their lifetime. And another fun fact is, one theory behind the signature whistle is that daughters will have similar whistles, similar signature whistle to their mother, whereas a son would have something different, something a bit more different. And one of the reasons we think that is because male calves eventually will leave their pod and they'll make their own, what we call a bachelor pod. So they'll go out in the ocean, they'll find their best friend, and those two will just kind of swim the ocean looking to make their own pods. And so they think that a reason their signature whistle might be different is because if they're swimming out there and they run into their sister or they run into their mom, they can recognize, oh wait, we're related. I'm gonna swim off and I'm gonna go find someone else. So that's a little fun fact there. So one of the other vocal types is a burst pulse. And that's something I look at. That's one of the vocals I'm trying to see if it's associated to that positive affect. So here's an example. So there's a little whistle at the end, but those kind of like honk sounds, it almost sounds like a seal. That's one type of burst pulse, but there's a ton of different types of burst pulses. And a lot of them, we don't necessarily know what they're used for, what they mean. They're so variable between dolphins and dolphin species. It's something we're still investigating. They use burst pulses during aggressive behaviors, but they've also used burst pulses in social behaviors. So finding out what about this burst pulse makes it angry versus makes it negative versus positive. So that's something I'm looking at in the positive side. Their other call type are echolocation clicks. and that's kind of similar to like how bats are. They send the signal out from their melon. So right here, they will send the signal out. Their melon is a very fatty, has a very fatty liquid tissue here, and helps to focus. They also have great control on their melon. If you also look when they echolocate, you'll see it kind of like change shape again. Just like when they change the shape of their blowhole, they'll like squish their melon around. And they can focus those echolocation clicks, and they send that signal out. So if I was an echolocation click, and then our little friend here sends me out, I go out and I hit an object, and my echo will reflect back. And I'll travel all the way back, and they'll receive these sounds in their lower jaw. So we get it straight here, we get it to our pennae, our ears, and it shoots it into our ear canal, etc. But they're actually getting these sounds in their lower jaw, and then it travels up the tissue here and into their inner ear, and then it gets transmitted to their brain. And then that's when they kind of translate what those sounds mean.
If you can imagine putting one end of a slinky between your teeth and then vibrations will travel up that slinky and then up your jaw. So they're kind of receiving those signals up their jaw to their ears.
Yeah, I like that example. Yeah, that's great. Any questions on the types of sounds so far?
Got a question over here.
Yeah, so you said that their signature whistle, so that's something that they use? Do other dolphins use it?
Ooh, good question. So there are some studies that have suggested that other dolphins will mimic someone else's signature whistle. And it's definitely something still being researched and debated. But one of the suggestions is, again, they're using another dolphin's name to either contact them, but sometimes they could just be, maybe trying to trick each other. It's definitely up in the air. A tricky thing with dolphin communication is localizing the signal. So when our technology, we put a hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone, we put it under the water and we record these sounds. And when you play it on special software, you're just seeing everything it picked up. Unless you have a whole giant array system, you need at least 3. So if you have a bunch of different microphones, which can be very expensive, you might be able to be like, that signal came from over there, this signal came from over there. But otherwise, you don't know where the signal's coming from. And also, if you don't have a camera under the water and you don't have good visibility, you don't know, sure, that came from over there, but who was it? Especially if you're doing wild dolphins, you don't know these animals out there. So the question is, well, who made that sound? What were they doing when they made that sound? So that's something that, technology, while it's starting to catch up, it's still not necessarily there. And that's what makes dolphin acoustic research a bit difficult, because we have so much information, we have these different sounds, but we can't always say, well, this is what they were doing and this dolphin said this, and compare this dolphin to this dolphin, or dolphins here in the bay to dolphins out in California. Yes.
Oh, I just had a kind of a question along those lines, and then a follow-up question. But it sounds like the interpretation of how a mother might use this calf would be a little different than how a human mom might call her children. So instead of she calls out her own name, and that's
it's very interesting.
Of calling the calf.
We don't understand the syntax of their communication. So we have rules to our language. That's why humans have language, but dolphins don't have language. They have a communication system. Because they might have rules, like this whistle, we have sentence structure. We have the noun, verb, and whatever else you're trying to say. We don't know if they have that. So it's interesting. So why is it that important to say your name? Maybe that's part of their rule. I say my name first, and then I give information. It's a great question. That's something like I would love to continue researching on. What do they have rules? Can we now move them from communication to language, and then how does their language function?
So to kind of follow that, I guess that what we currently know about dolphin communication likely comes from a combination of what we've observed with captive dolphins and then what we've observed with wild dolphins. So, assuming that's a safe assumption.
Yeah.
So you chose to focus on the positive affect communication. So, and you're using hydrophones. Are you also combining information from captive dolphins? Or is there enough baseline information for you to know that to be able to assign certain sounds to positive versus negative affect?
Yeah, so my work is with captive dolphins.
Oh, okay.
I did some field work with Dolphin Research Center out in the Keys, and something we would like to do is extend it to wild dolphins, because there is the debate. These captive dolphins are experiencing a far different environment than a wild dolphin is. And since they are pretty intelligent creatures, their vocal repertoire, the signals they use, it might be different than signals a wild dolphin use. The trainers will train them to make certain sounds. The trainer likes that, and they'll cue the dolphin and give it positive reinforcement. I like that sound you did. Let's use that as one of, your training examples. So they could have a different repertoire than wild dolphins. So comparing them, I think there's some validity in a general comparison between them, but it would be difficult to say what we see as their vocal repertoire in captive animals is the same as what we're seeing in wild dolphins. I would definitely assume that there's a difference there. So the positive signals I might find in captive animals might be different than positive signals for the wild animals, which would be great extension. We're hoping maybe we could record dolphins when they're bow riding or when they're doing play behaviors. But again, like I had mentioned earlier, the struggle would be localizing that signal to that dolphin, because I might see the dolphin and be like, okay, the sound is maybe coming from that one, but for all I know, there's a dolphin underwater, either in front of me, behind me, under the boat, out in the distance that I'm picking up, and my localization's wrong. It's kind of give and take. You can be more specific in your research with captive dolphins, I feel, than with wild dolphins, and it's just because technology isn't always, it's not always there for you.
Mm-hmm. There's a more controlled environment, but you can't necessarily, or you don't know yet whether you can make correlations between the sounds that you are analyzing or assigning a positive or negative affect for captive dolphins to the wild dolphins.
Correct, yes. But one day we'll know it all. I hope to be one of them.
Yeah, so you guys start somewhere. As far as, creating the baseline, the foundational research.
Yes.
So what other, so can you give us kind of I know you gave a few examples, but are there clear behaviors or responses that you would, if you're watching dolphins and you're like logging information and say that was a positive affect, that was negative, that, you know. So could you just describe your process of assigning those?
Yeah, so how I'm doing it in my work right now.
So if you are not actively doing that, I mean, are you using a baseline of work that had already kind of assigned certain sounds to these positive or negative?
So how I'm doing it in positive affect in especially dolphins, there's not too much out there. There's a lot of focus, and it's kind of a trend in animal behavior to look at the negative affects. A first thing we kind of want to look at is what's wrong. And for some reason, negative behaviors are much more easier to catch than positive behaviors.
So when you say what's wrong, it might be pain, distress.
Right, pain, stress,
aggression.
If you see pacing, you see animals twitching their tails or, biting on themselves, it's a bit easier for us to kind of be like, that's not normal. That's kind of off the norm in a negative way.
Is there more of a focus on that because the animals are captive, so people are really watching for that?
I do think that's some of it. I do think, we want to make sure they're at least not doing poorly, so we look for those behaviors first. I do think there is some struggle in, because you don't want to anthropomorphize the animals, which is a fancy term for saying you don't necessarily want to humanize the animal. They have a different perspective than we do. What's important to us doesn't necessarily mean it's important to them. Someone might hurt your feelings, but if you did that to an animal, they might not get their feelings hurt and, walk away. So I think when it comes to positive affect or being like, oh, look, they're happy, especially with scientists are like, well, are they? Are you sure? Like, how do you know they're happy? And so that's definitely some positive affect and the behaviors and, what constitutes this, positive side of emotion. There hasn't been a lot of focus. There are some. So, we've got play behaviors. Well, if they're playing, we assume like, okay, they're probably at least in this positive state of mind. And for my work, we kind of induce that. So when they're not on session and they're just kind of like, they're not doing anything with the guests, they're just doing their own thing in their lagoons, we'll surprise them with buckets of ice. And we've made the assumption that they love buckets of ice or they love ice because they always go for it. There's a lot of activity, and we kind of correlate that. Okay, well, if they're not running away from it, they're not trying to avoid it, they don't seem like disinterested. So we make that assumption there's something positive about being surprised or getting these buckets of ice. And then another way we induce it, at least for my work, is we give them a new training and try and see if they get it correct. These guys, they're very smart and they like to try and figure things out. So when you give them this new behavior, and we kind of gave them like a puzzle, like if I show you this, if I show you a blue shovel, I want you to do a dance. And they've never been told to do something like that, to try and figure out that correlation. So we see, can you try and figure out this correlation? And then when they get it right, we assume, because they love, to do new things and learn something, and they get that positive reinforcement, hey, you did it. The dolphins that I've worked with, when they get it and the trainer tells them, hey, you did it right, you figured it out, they make this super loud, almost like that bray that I showed earlier, that kind of honk. They make a really loud, like, screech sound. There was one scientist previously, him and his colleagues, Dr. Ridgway, he suggested dolphins have a victory squeal. And that's kind of where my project stemmed from. So the victory squeal, he had some Navy dolphins. He took them out just off the coast, and he had them set up in a boat just across the way. And what the boat would do would release a fish, and they would release the Navy dolphin. And they had a very humorous, if you ever look it up and see the picture, it's a dolphin. It has a suction cupped GoPro on it to videotape and to record the sounds. And so when the dolphin went to go catch the fish, just before it would catch it, or right as it would catch that fish, it made a similar sound. It made this burst pulse, like, I know I'm gonna catch it, and it would go, woohoo! And then, or it would, like, as it caught it, again, it would make this, like, woohoo! And so he's like, I think there's something there. I think, and he called it, so he came up with the term victory squeal. And so from that, they're like, maybe there's a signal out there. Again, he is using trained dolphins, you know, that there's some sort of signal, and they use that to express themselves. Again, we very much express ourselves with gestures and movement, but dolphins might be expressing themselves vocally. And so if we want to know kind of what's going on internally, especially with like their state of mind or their potential emotion, it's important for us to try and figure out their acoustic repertoire, because that's most likely how they're going to express themselves is vocally versus these physical behaviors. So we've know a lot of their physical behaviors, what they do. You know, sometimes when they're feeling sassy, they curve their bodies to make like a little an S shape. It's their sassy position. When they're trying to show themselves off, I look so handsome today. So they'll make an S shape. They can be tactile, and they'll rub against each other. During bouts of aggression, they'll use their teeth, and they do rake marks, and they'll kind of scratch each other with their teeth. So we see these physical behaviors, but again, if they rely so much on these acoustic signals, knowing what they mean or when they use it could give us far more insight into what these behaviors mean, what are they doing. If we are recording them and we can't see them, but we can hear them, and we know what the sounds mean now, then we can do a lot of wild research. We don't need all these fancy cameras. We can just record them, and we can be like, oh, I heard a victory squeal. They probably had a successful feeding, and that could help us monitor their population. If we know successful feeding is happening here versus no feeding, we can see, oh, something's going on with this population. I'm not hearing XYZ signals, so maybe they're not doing so hot. But or I am hearing all these things, so they're being successful in growing their population. They're being successful in catching food. So there's a lot to still learn, and great potential if we could figure out what all these sounds mean.
Are there big differences between the vocalizations of bottlenose dolphins and other species of dolphins?
Yes, there are differences between species. So even within, so there are suggestions of population differences, like kind of, you can think of it like dialects. So they've especially very much noted this with humpbacks. So you have like the North California population, their sounds are much higher. They have higher pitch sounds. And then the South California, same species, but they have lower pitch sounds. They use lower frequencies. So there's differences within population and then across species of.
So is it thought that if you have those differences within the same species, mm-hmm. and so sort of like biologically, anatomically, they'd be fairly, there would be sort of some consistency that it might be learned?
Yeah, so there's definitely learning strategies going on, especially if they're learning their own whistle, learning their kin's whistle. There's definitely vocal development, vocal learning, which is again kind of why there's that struggle in comparing a captive population to a wild population, because we already know that within population, if across different regions, can have different vocal characteristics, whether it's the type of sound itself. So maybe the South Dolphins will have a whistle that looks like an S, but the North Dolphins we don't really see that. They use just straight lines. But there's also, they both use the S, but the S are higher frequency, and then over here the S's are lower frequency. So there is definite variation, and again, that's, it just makes vocal communication, learning what these sounds mean, even more complicated, because then it's like, well, what do we compare? Is this dolphin just being lazy? Does changing your frequency mean you're just changing your tone of voice? Or is this shift in frequency because the environment's changed? So maybe in North California, there's a lot of boats, and so it's very loud. Boats make super loud noises, and a lot of the frequency for boats is low. So maybe the reason that those dolphins switch to high frequency is so that they kind of sound above the boat noise.
Interesting.
So the sound in the ocean is also a potential impact on how the dolphins are communicating. And they've seen that too. They'll shift either the frequency or the loudness. They might, if there's so much ocean noise, whether it be from man-made noise or perhaps there's like a lightning storm going on, like they'll change the amplitude or the loudness of their call. Because, yeah.
Well, and like sound would move through water too, when the water is different densities.
Correct.
So, if the water's saltier or, just different, the sound just moves differently through water.
Yeah,
at different depths and at different temperatures.
Exactly. So like sound, it likes to move towards cold. So like if you I'll give an example, like out in air. So the best, and when you go out in the morning, you hear a lot of birds calling. And it's kind of prime hour for bird calls, because when it's cold, the sound's able to travel further. So they have a better chance of getting their sounds out if they're talking at that nice brisk morning time. And so when we talk about the acoustic communication, there's not only is there noise that could change how they develop their sounds or shift their sounds, whether it's a permanent shift or a temporary shift. You've got, and then you have just the environment itself. Temperature will change how sound moves in the water. The salinity will change it. Even pH can even change it. So it's kind of just a lot of these compounding factors that make acoustic communication a bit more complicated. If you kind of think about being at a concert, it's a lot of loud noise, and you end up getting closer and closer and closer together because you can't hear each other, or you just don't talk at all. So you can kind of think like that's sometimes the ocean. If you have dredging going on, people are going out on their boats, you've got people on their skis, people just splashing, fish are making noise, coral will even make noise.
I think the ocean is a lot noisier than a lot of people realize.
Yes.
Jacques Cousteau famously wrote a book you know, I think the title was The Silent Sea, but
Yeah.
you know, we are increasingly understanding how noisy the ocean is.
The noise is, the ocean noise is, you look out and we're always like, oh, the ocean is so serene, it's so beautiful, but if you just stuck your head under there, there's so much noise going on, and sound in water travels 4.5 times faster underwater than in air. So I could say something here and someone will hear it across the street in a second. But if I said it underwater, they're going to hear it 4.5 times faster, because sound travels much faster under there. The medium's just better for it. So you have all this noise, and not only is it traveling very fast from whether it's your boat or the big cargo ship or another dolphin, the sound's traveling super fast. It also travels much further. So I could shout to someone across the street and they'll hear it, but I could or they might not hear it. And I shout to someone underwater and they probably would hear it because it travels further down there. So you might see a dolphin way over there, and I'm like, oh, they're far enough. They're not going to hear me. They most likely probably are. In fact, there's been studies, and as a boat approaches, dolphins will stop talking. They'll stop talking, and someone did a study with some drones, and they'll just they'll change direction and start kind of curving around where that boat would start heading towards them. So they don't, while some dolphins do approach boats, they don't necessarily really want to be there, and they hear you way before you probably even see them, or you would hear them above water. And yeah.
So, I mean, it's clearly very complex to understand. You enumerated a lot of the complexities. So, we're still working to create a foundation for this knowledge. And, I mean, as far as I know, most captive dolphins are bottlenose dolphins. They're a particular species, but I don't know what percentage of captive dolphins would be bottlenose versus other types. So are there other species of captive dolphins that people are looking at the sounds for them as well?
Yeah, so orcas are still technically dolphins, even though it's killer whale. They are a toothed whale. They are an odontocete, so orcas would count. There's also some beluga whales. I know out in one of the institutions in Florida, they have stenos. Stenos are pretty interesting, but all this interesting thing with the stenos is they're rough-toothed dolphins. At least the ones at the facilities, they're mostly deaf. But there's not too much research on the wild rough-tooths, but the studies that have looked at the wild rough-tooths, they seem to not have as good hearing either, or they appear to be going deaf sooner than a bottlenose would. Why? I don't know. Who knows? So there could be hearing differences in different species, which could then associate to their tolerance of ocean noise, and then also the parameters at what vocals they use and what amplitude and frequencies that they use.
So, okay, so you just mentioned a scant handful of different species. I mean, is that we just have a few different species of dolphins that
there's not too many. So there is the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which was passed in 1972, I believe. And which it pretty much protects all the wild animals. So it's against the law to go out there with your boat and go find a dolphin and be like, hey, and give them some of your fish. So it protects them both that way, but also we can't go out there and be like, I want a new species in this aquarium. So we can, maybe it's not just for show, but we want to learn more, so let's get another species, and learn from that, because captive, it's again that controlled environment, but we can't do that. It's the Marine Mammal Protection Act prevents that. You can't go out and find a marine mammal and take it back to the aquarium. So kind of what we have is what we have.
So going back to the rough-toothed dolphins, does that suggest to you or to people who are studying them that maybe some species are less dependent on vocalization? Maybe that would
I think they
relate to their environment or something?
I think they're still pretty. I think there's still high focus or high need for their acoustic vocalizations. I think what shifts is the type. So burst pulses are very broad range. They cover a lot of different frequencies at once. Whistles are very tonal. If you looked at an image of a whistle, it's like a pencil drawing. It's a line. So they can be so they only cover a certain amount, and usually it's high frequencies. Whales will mostly have these broad, they'll have broad calls, and they also have low frequency calls. And that low frequency calls travel even further. High frequency calls don't travel very far underwater, even with even with sound traveling pretty darn far. And one reason for that is whales don't travel in these nice dense pods. They're more spread out. So whales need their calls to travel further. So they have these low frequency calls. Dolphins are usually, while there's space between them, they're at least in these kind of tight-knit pods. So they don't need to have these low frequency calls all the time. These high frequency calls will suffice. That's enough for them to travel over there. So I think any marine mammal very much relies a lot on their acoustic communication and hearing their signals from either other dolphins or different species, different marine mammals, or fish, whatever they're trying to hear and listen into. I just think depending on their species, they might use a different call type, whether it's those burst pulses or low frequency calls, high frequency calls, depending on, what their lifestyle is and what their environment is. I think that kind of helps shape their repertoire, if that makes sense. Yes.
You guys feel free to.
You briefly mentioned about some species could go deaf quicker than the bottlenose that you were looking at. If a dolphin were to go deaf, is that detrimental for them? I mean, are they able to still know what they need to know to function?
Yeah, they can. So they can still get things done. They've got. They'll lean a bit more on tactile. So I briefly worked with a mother and calf dolphin, and the mother was starting to go not only just a bit deaf, but also a little bit blind in one of her eyes. So you would see, while she would actually vocalize more. You'd hear her, she would use her signature whistle, especially because she had a calf. She would use her signature whistle more than the other moms, and her calf more often, if the calf did leave her side, she went to go find the calf. So they'll adjust their behaviors. They're pretty self-aware of what's going on. So if I can't see and I'm starting not really to hear, I'm going to make myself more known. At least in the case of this dolphin, she would vocalize even more, like, here I am, and she would stay closer to her calf. She would make sure, I need to at least swing by, so they stay in these more close-knit than a dolphin who's overall healthy. So they're very smart. They're great little creatures. They'll compensate until they can't compensate anymore. Great question, though. Any other questions? Yes? Yeah.
So would you say that the ultimate goal, because I know that like bioacoustic research is like an exploding field for like a ton of reasons. I've heard talk like used for detection of invasive species, like all that stuff.
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
Yeah. Sorry, I mumble when I ask questions. It's gonna look. Anyway, so would you say that the ultimate goal for this research is to like identify not only like differences between populations but their health, but like do you think you could get to a point where you could recognize a name whistle apart from other whistles and therefore be like, okay, based on the number of name whistles we heard in a certain area, could you like count how many dolphins are in that pod? Or like, like what, like what are some of the like target possibilities or like the high priority possibilities for that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a huge goal. I think so. There's research out in Florida, and they have incredible permits and they'll do health assessments. And they've been working on the particular population of dolphins out there for over 50 years. And they've recorded, what they'll do is they go out and they have permits to briefly catch the dolphins. So they'll catch the dolphins and they kind of just have them on a tarp, and they've got like minutes to do a ton of sampling. They'll record the dolphin. One person's recording, the other one's getting blood work, the other one's getting a biopsy. So they do a lot of work, and then they, take the dolphin back, and they do that for practically the entire day. And so they've got a pretty good database on those dolphins, and one of them is their signature whistles. So they have signature whistles of just about every dolphin there. And something that they can do, and they've done, I don't know how many times, but they've done it a few times. They'll record, and they'll be like, and they'll go out, take some recordings, bring it back, and be like, okay, that signature whistle matches Bob, there's Sarah, there's Charles, Tiffany, etc. And they'll just go down the list of all their recordings, and they are able to at least somewhat keep track of that population with the signature whistles. And
so how is the signature whistle differentiated from other whistles?
So what they use is they look at all the frequency parameters. So like the beginning frequency, the end frequency. Again, if we think of that whistle, it's like a line or like a little fun little S shape. The contour of it, the shape of it's different. So they compare the shape of it, and in one way or another, that shape's different. Sometimes the frequency parameters do shift. We don't know why that's important.
So it's different than other whistles they make?
Yeah.
And then different than the whistles that a different dolphin might make?
Yeah, so there's a particular shape of whistle that only I use, and it's different than all the other whistles and words that I say. So they use that shape and be like.
But if you didn't have like a big database of sounds, would there be a way to have like a recording of, I don't know, an individual dolphin, say an hour's worth of their whistles and clicks? Could you identify its signature whistle, or do you need more information than that?
Well, always more information the better. I don't think just an hour necessarily would be
Just
enough.
asking if there's something. I don't think I'm articulating my question well enough. Is there something that is unique about a particular, not an individual that says that's an individual, but a signature sound?
Yeah.
So that it's just different than anything else that they would use for communication.
Yes. So what has been suggested about just the signature whistle itself is that if that dolphin is in isolation, it takes of all the sounds they make while they're in isolation, they are using a specific shape or specific whistle 80 to 90% of the time.
Oh.
So, and that's kind of where, way back in the day when they suggested and kind of like, hey, I think this means something, that was finding that out. I believe it was Peter Tyak was one of the first researchers to start suggesting signature whistle. That's what they noted. These dolphins, when they're in isolation, they're using just this one sound 80 to 90% of the time.
Wow, it's really striking.
Yes, so like, potentially, yeah, if that dolphin's in isolation, you're recording it for an hour, you could be getting it, but you would want to make sure that you can repeat the results that you're seeing. So get it in isolation again next week, or a week after that, and
Make sure it's not saying
right. Make sure it's not. Yeah, make sure it's not just help.
Okay, so it's using its signature whistle. And then, so, there's like a database of the dolphin fins, so you could identify individuals if you can record those fins. So this may translate to a database of the signature whistles that might be easier to use if they can use hydrophones instead of photographers on the water.
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think if we can build databases, acoustic databases of signature whistles, or even databases of what all these other whistles might mean, you could drop hydrophones just about anywhere. Going out on your boat and doing photo ID is great, and that's definitely what we use right now, and it's fantastic. This could, at least right now, be a supplement to that, to help with that. But it could, if we get it good enough, you could just put hydrophones out there that could stay out there for months to years and save
of populations that would be resident versus,
for sure,
migratory or.
Yeah, you can see where are your resident dolphins that are here all year. What are the ones coming and just passing through?
So is there something that you would kind of like to leave everybody with as kind of a big picture message?
Big picture message. Dolphins are amazing. Again, acoustic, we've gone over kind of a lot of acoustic research. It's not necessarily in its infancy, but there's just so much still, especially technology-wise, to learn. But we're getting there, and at least like almost big picture-wise, I think being conscious as the public that there's lots of noise out there. Our dolphins are talking to each other when we see them, when we don't see them. So be clear, like noise. You can't hear me.
Talk louder.
Either talk louder or wait for it to pass. So be cognizant that you're making noise. They're trying to make noise. So if you see a dolphin, or just let it be. Don't chase it down. You can. A great thing is also, stop your boat because you're making a lot of noise, and then you get to just out and watch what they do. That's it.
Well, thank you. Thanks for joining us. We've got some